My name is Clara Reynolds. I am 29 years old. And last month, I was denied a seat at my own father's funeral. Marcus Reynolds wasn't just my father, he was my home. After my mother died of lymphoma when I was 13, it was just the two of us. He raised me while building his real estate company from scratch in the heart of Chicago. We weren't wealthy growing up, but we had each other, and that made everything feel full. 4 years ago, he met Isabelle. She was elegant, warm in public, and already had 2 teenage children, Derek, who was 18, and Fiona, then 16. She was a widow, or so she said. I tried to give her a chance, really, I did. Dad seemed happy for the first time in years. He called her a second chance at life. But the second she moved into our house, it stopped feeling like home. She began with small things, replacing old family photos with hers, changing the decor in my mother's favorite room, and organizing family dinners that somehow never included me.
Derek treated our house like a hotel. Fiona never spoke to me unless she needed something. My once vibrant relationship with Dad slowly faded under a tide of new routines, whispered conversations, and family events I wasn't told about. I flew in the moment I heard he was hospitalized. I called, texted, begged to see him. Isabelle answered each time. Her tone sweet but firm. The doctors said only immediate family. When I reminded her I was his only daughter, she replied with a practiced chuckle, "Let's not cause drama right now." Clara, I never got to say goodbye. He passed 2 days later. When I arrived at the funeral, an usher glanced at the program, barely made eye contact, and pointed me to a seat near the back, nowhere near Isabelle and her children, who sat proudly in the front row as if they had lost a king. No one introduced me. Some guests even asked if I was a friend of the deceased. When I finally approached the casket, they were closing the lid. I stood there, frozen, my hands trembling, my chest hollow. It was like I had lost him twice, once to death, and once to a carefully choreographed erasure. During the eulogy, Isabelle's voice rang through the chapel. She spoke of her wonderful husband, their beautiful blended family, and how he had finally found peace. She never said my name. Not once. But I noticed how her eyes flicked toward me, daring me to react. I didn't. I sat there, silent, my nails digging into my palms, replaying our last conversation in my mind, the way he'd whispered something about making things right, about a package I would understand. I didn't know it then, but he had seen what was happening, and he had left me more than just memories. I didn't know it then, but he had seen what was happening, and he had left me more than just memories. 3 days after the funeral, I was still in Chicago, holed up in a quiet hotel near the edge of the city. I hadn't returned to my apartment in New York. I couldn't not with everything unresolved. The air around me felt thick with absence. My father's voice still echoed in my mind, especially that final conversation. "There's something for you. You'll understand when the time comes." That time came sooner than I expected. It was nearly noon when the knock sounded on my hotel room door. I wasn't expecting anyone. With hesitation, I peeked through the peephole. Standing there was Edith Langston, my father's executive assistant of nearly 20 years. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, though she'd squeezed my hand tightly as we passed in the reception line. She looked both nervous and determined. "Clara, may I come in? I can't be seen standing here long." I stepped aside without a word. Once inside, she opened her large leather handbag and pulled out a sealed manila envelope, thick, slightly worn, and closed with an old-fashioned red wax seal bearing the imprint of my father's signet ring. My breath caught. "He gave this to me 2 months ago," she said, lowering her voice. "Told me to deliver it to you in person, only if something happened, I promised him I would." She left shortly after, refusing tea or conversation. "Be careful," was all she said before slipping back into the hallway. With trembling hands, I broke the wax and opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter from my father, a sealed legal document from a firm I didn't recognize, and a small silver key taped to a card with a bank's name and safety deposit box number. But there was no time to process. Because that same afternoon, I learned through a quiet tip from my father's former attorney that the will reading would take place the next day at 2 p.m. at the firm of Denning and Cole. I wasn't invited. The next day, I arrived anyway, dressed in muted black. I walked into the glass and marble office, told the receptionist my name, and waited as she made a hushed phone call. Her eyes flicked to me with concern. A moment later, a door opened, and Isabelle herself appeared. She didn't look surprised to see me, only mildly amused. "This meeting is only for heirs named in the will," she said coolly. "But I suppose you've always had trouble understanding boundaries." I didn't flinch. "I'm his daughter. I have a right to hear what's being said." Her smile widened. "The kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Suit yourself, but don't expect to hear your name mentioned." The conference room was filled with polished wood, crystal water pitchers, and expensive silence. Seated at the long table were Isabelle, Derek, Fiona, her personal attorney, and 2 firm partners. I sat alone at the far end, unwelcome but undeterred. The reading began. The lawyer, a well-coiffed man named Cole Abrams, opened a sleek black folder and began reciting the contents of the will dated January 3rd. My name was never spoken. Everything my father's company, our family home, the vacation property in Lake Geneva, his art collection, even his sailing memorabilia was to be passed in full to Isabelle, with secondary beneficiaries listed as Derek and Fiona. When he finished, Isabelle let out a small sigh of theatrical grief. He always said he wanted things simple. I stared at her, numb. Across the table, Derek looked pleased with himself, his fingers tapping a silent beat on the mahogany. Fiona avoided my gaze. Cole asked if there were any objections. I stood, slowly. I walked to the head of the table and pulled the sealed envelope from my bag. "Actually, I believe there's a mistake." Cole frowned. "Excuse me? This is a more recent will," I said. "Executed by my father 6 weeks before his death, with a separate firm. It includes state registration and verified witnesses, and it revokes all previous versions." Isabelle's face froze, then twisted. "That's absurd. Robert would have told me." She snatched for the document, but Cole intercepted it. He examined the seal, the firm's letterhead, the date. His face tightened. "This appears legitimate. We'll need to verify its authenticity." "You're not seriously entertaining this," Isabelle snapped, her voice rising. "This is a setup, a lie. My husband would never do this." Cole raised a hand. "Isabelle, please, if this document is verified, it would supersede the one just read." She laughed once, dry and angry. He was confused in his final months. "You all know it. Clara was never around. She didn't care. She just wants his money. I didn't respond. I didn't need to." The envelope spoke for itself. Cole read the first paragraph aloud, then the second. His voice slowed as the clauses unfolded, gifting modest trust to Isabelle and her children. "Instructing the sale of the family home to fund a charitable foundation in my mother's name, and granting controlling interest in Reynolds and Company. To me." At the final clause, his voice stopped altogether. "In the event that my death should occur under circumstances that raise concern, I request a full medical review and independent investigation." The room went utterly silent. Isabelle's eyes darted to the door. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. This is not over. But we both knew. In that moment, the tide had turned. The mask was slipping. And my father's true voice, long silenced, was finally being heard. Isabelle's face had drained of color, her voice rising in disbelief. But the words in my father's final will had already cut through the room like a blade. There was no undoing what had just been read. My father had seen through her and left a trail. Now it was my turn to follow it. That night, back at the hotel, I placed the sealed legal document and the small key from the envelope on the table in front of me. Along with them was his letter still creased from my hands. But I read it again. Slowly this time. His voice echoed in my mind with each sentence, firm and steady despite the fear woven beneath his words. "My dearest Clara," it began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass." He apologized not for dying, but for not protecting me sooner. He admitted what I had long suspected, that Isabelle's charm had been a mask, and that behind it, She had slowly stripped him of his control, his clarity, even his identity. He confessed to noticing changes in his medication, in his energy, in how his friends were gradually pushed out of his life. I began documenting everything. He wrote, "I've made arrangements in case I couldn't act fast enough." The next morning, I took the key and the address card to First Federal Bank on Wabash Avenue. After a series of identity checks and signatures, a manager escorted me into a private viewing room. He brought out a long, brushed steel safety deposit box, placed it on the table, and left me alone. My hands were shaking as I inserted the key inside. I found not just one revelation, but a careful map of my father's descent into suspicion and then clarity. The first item was a second letter. This one was more analytical, less emotional. It listed dates and observations, like a detective's notebook. He had noticed how certain pills made him drowsy, how Isabelle always volunteered to pick up his prescriptions, how a man whom she claimed to have no contact with was seen on their property while he was away. There were photos, dozens, most taken from a distance, grainy but clear enough to see Isabelle meeting a man in hotel lobbies and parking garages. In one, they embraced. In another, they exchanged envelopes. Taped to the back of one photo was a sticky note in my father's handwriting, "James, her estranged husband." Still very much in the picture. Below the photos were bank statements and printed emails, communications between Isabelle and her brother, whose name I barely remembered. They discussed transfers, timing, and getting the paperwork right. One email, dated just 2 weeks before my father's hospitalization, included the line, "Make sure the dosages are exact. We can't afford a scare too early." I sat in stunned silence. The worst, however, came in digital form, a small thumb drive, labeled in my father's pen, "Audio Office." I plugged it into my laptop and scrolled through the dated recordings. They were private recordings he had made from his home office recordings he had started after growing suspicious. I clicked on one. Isabelle's voice, sharp and unfiltered, filled the room. "He still signs anything I put in front of him, as long as I bring him his tea and pills. He doesn't even blink." Then Derek, "You think he suspects anything, Isabelle again, not with the blue ones. They keep him dazed enough. He doesn't ask questions anymore." I slammed the lid of the laptop shut. It was all there. Proof not just of manipulation, but something darker, something bordering on criminal. My father hadn't merely feared being taken advantage of, he had feared being erased. Beneath the recordings, I found a final document folded, fragile with age, the real will. It matched the copy presented at the reading, complete with notarized signatures, but this version bore my father's unmistakable handwritten notes in the margins, underlined clauses, stars next to certain names, and next to mine, just one word written in capital letters, "Trust." I pressed my palm over the paper, willing him to feel my gratitude, my grief. Leaving the bank, I knew that the courtroom confrontation had only been the beginning. This, what I held in my bag, was not just leverage. It was a lifeline to the truth. Evidence, not just of deceit, but of calculated betrayal. A woman who had convinced my father she loved him, while plotting his silence. What haunted me most was the timeline. Had he acted too late? Had she hastened things? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I would find it. I owed him that much. I took a taxi straight to the office of a lawyer I had contacted the night before, Andrea Lynn, a specialist in contested estates and elder abuse cases. When I placed the contents of the box on her table, her expression shifted from professional neutrality to horrified disbelief. "You understand," she said slowly. "This isn't just a will dispute. If this evidence holds up, we're looking at criminal charges, possibly worse." I nodded. The woman who smiled as I was seated in the back row at my father's funeral had no idea what was coming. She had stolen his final moments from me. But he had left behind a voice stronger than hers, one that could still speak, still defend, and still expose everything she thought she had buried. The woman who smiled as I was seated in the back row at my father's funeral had no idea what was coming. She thought she had buried the truth with him, but what he left behind was far more powerful than she ever imagined. 2 days after the reading of the real will, Isabelle's mask began to crack. News of the contested will spread quickly through my father's old business circle. Some of his longtime partners and friends, people who hadn't even acknowledged me at the funeral, started calling, not with apologies, but with curiosity, confusion, concern. Whispers followed the name Isabelle Reynolds now, and not the kind that carried admiration. Her carefully cultivated image of the grieving, graceful widow was beginning to unravel. The media caught wind next. A small column in the local business journal speculated on unusual legal developments surrounding the estate of Marcus Reynolds.
By the week's end, an anonymous blog had published a timeline of the competing wills, calling it The House Divided. Meanwhile, Andrea Lynn, my attorney, moved quickly. She filed a motion to freeze all estate assets, citing potential fraud and conflicting legal directives in the documentation. We also filed to have Isabelle removed as executor of the original will, based on the clear and notarized instructions in the newer one. The court granted a temporary freeze. Isabelle, in response, changed the security codes to the family home. She fired all household staff and replaced them with new faces. When I tried to access the property to retrieve documents tied to the foundation my father had instructed me to establish, I was told I was trespassing. Then came the threats. It started subtly. An unmarked envelope slid under my hotel room door. No message. Just a grainy photo of me walking to the courthouse, circled in red ink.
Then came the anonymous emails. You're not safe in this city. Go home while you still can. One night, I returned to find my room in disarray. Nothing was stolen, but drawers were opened, my luggage disturbed, and the folder containing my father's medical records had been tampered with. Andrea demanded the hotel review security footage. The cameras caught a man in a maintenance uniform entering my room at 2:37 a.m. His face was never clearly visible. That same week, Derek contacted me. He asked to meet alone, quietly, at a small coffee shop on Southport Avenue. He looked different, worn, anxious. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. I found something, he said, sliding a paper bag across the table. Inside were 3 prescription bottles, all labeled in my father's name, but the labels were torn. And one bottle contained pills I didn't recognize. I looked up sharply. She told me not to mention them. He said they were special supplements, but I heard her once. On the phone, she said, "The blue ones keep him compliant." I thought she was joking. He trailed off. I asked why he was giving them to me now. Because I think something's wrong, he said simply, and I'm not going to lie for her. 2 days later, Fiona reached out. She was less composed. Her voice trembled when she spoke, and she wore no makeup, something I'd never seen before. We met in the back corner of a bookstore cafe. She promised me the Westwood condo. Fiona blurted before I could say a word. Said it would be mine once the things settled. That was last year. I didn't understand what she meant until now. She pulled out a napkin and started folding and unfolding it as she spoke. I don't know what's true anymore. But I know my mother wasn't who she pretended to be with Robert. She hated when he talked about your mom. Hated the old photos. I used to catch her throwing them away.
I felt something shift in that moment. Sympathy, maybe, or the ache of knowing we were all, in some way, victims of the same performance. Later that week, we received word that Isabelle had hired a new lawyer, one known in legal circles for dragging estate cases through years of procedural delays. Andrea rolled her eyes when she heard the name. This is a stalling tactic. She's trying to pressure you into settling. I didn't flinch. My father hadn't raised me to run. He'd raised me to think, to persevere, and most of all, to stand tall in the face of injustice. Andrea and I doubled down. We submitted affidavits from witnesses to the second will. We included transcribed audio from the thumb drive, though we withheld the most damning clips, saving them for court. We arranged a toxicology review of the preserved blood samples from my father's hospitalization. The hospital had stored them due to the unusual circumstances of his rapid decline. I returned to my hotel one evening to find a single white rose placed on my pillow. No card, no note. By then, I had stopped being afraid, because beneath the fear, the threats, and the performances was something no one could deny anymore. The truth was taking shape, and the day of reckoning was getting closer. The truth was taking shape, and the day of reckoning was getting closer. 3 weeks after the real will was presented, the courtroom was packed for the preliminary hearing.
Reporters sat hunched over notepads in the back row, whispering into phones. Friends of the family, some of whom hadn't spoken to me since my mother's funeral, now watched with expressions ranging from pity to unease. But I wasn't watching them. I was watching her. Isabelle walked in like a widow from a soap opera draped in black, a silk scarf knotted around her neck, sunglasses perched dramatically on her head even inside. She didn't look at me.
Derek walked 2 steps behind her, his face pale and unreadable. Fiona wasn't there. Judge Margaret Halstead, a no-nonsense woman in her late 60s, took the bench with brisk authority. "Let's get to it," she said. "We are here to determine the validity of the contested wills and the appointment of the executor, as well as to hear any preliminary motions from both parties." Isabelle's lawyer, Richard Carver, tall and smug, rose first. "Your Honor, the will dated January 3rd was executed under the full awareness and consent of Mr. Marcus Reynolds, who was of sound mind at the time. The subsequent document is a fabrication, presented under suspicious circumstances and likely signed under coercion." He went on about how I had abandoned my father, how Isabelle had been the only constant in his life during his final months, and how I had swooped in after the funeral like a scavenger hungry for inheritance. Andrea Lynn stood when it was our turn. Calm, precise, unshakable. "We will present not only the updated will, properly notarized and registered with the state, but also supporting documentation proving Mr. Reynolds had grown deeply concerned about the conduct of his wife in the final year of his life. He sought legal counsel outside of his household, secretly altered his estate planning, and recorded substantial evidence regarding changes to his medication and isolation from loved ones." She called our first witness Walter Gaines, my father's longtime friend and former attorney. Walter walked to the stand with quiet dignity. When he was sworn in, he looked directly at the judge and spoke with measured gravity. "Marcus called me 7 months before his death. He was disturbed. He said he suspected Isabelle was intercepting communications, replacing medications, and deliberately isolating him from his daughter and business partners. He asked for the name of an attorney outside his firm to help him prepare a new will without his wife's knowledge." "Was he coherent?" the judge asked. "Very much so," Walter said, clear, firm, and deeply troubled. Carver objected on hearsay grounds, but the judge allowed the testimony as insight into my father's mental state and intentions. Then came the security footage. Grainy, time-stamped images of Isabelle meeting James Sterling, her estranged husband, at a boutique hotel not far from our house. Photos showed them embracing, exchanging documents, and even entering the same suite. Each image drained more color from Isabelle's face. Then Andrea played a 90-second audio clip from my father's private office recordings. Isabelle's voice echoed through the courtroom. "He doesn't even question them anymore. I switched the labels. Blue ones first puts him right to sleep. It's easier that way." The courtroom went completely silent. Then Judge Halstead asked the unthinkable, "Is there anyone else who wishes to testify?" Derek stood. I hadn't asked him to. I didn't know he would. But he stood, hands trembling, and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Carver hissed at him to sit down. Isabelle's lips parted in horror, but Derek didn't falter. He was sworn in, and as he took the stand, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Shame. My mother told me to keep an eye on him. She said he was slipping, and that we had to protect what was rightfully ours. At first, I believed her. I mean, she's my mom. He paused, then looked at me. But then I heard things. I found bottles in her closet, labeled for Robert, but filled with different pills. One night, I overheard her arguing with James, her ex-husband. She said, "We can't wait forever. He's stronger than the last one." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Andrea asked, "Why are you coming forward now?" "Because I can't live with it," Derek whispered. "Because Robert was kind to us. Because Clara deserves to know the truth. And because I don't want to be like her." Isabelle sat frozen. Her face no longer defiant, but blank, like someone who had forgotten which role she was playing. Then came the final blow. Toxicology results had returned that morning. Dr. Olivia Chen, a toxicologist, testified that samples of my father's blood taken during his final hospitalization revealed elevated levels of clonidine and scopolamine, two medications that, in high doses, can cause confusion, fatigue,
and cardiovascular distress. Neither had been prescribed. The presence of these drugs is inconsistent with the treatment Mr. Reynolds was receiving. Dr. Chen said, it is possible they contributed to, or accelerated, his cardiac failure. The judge took only 10 minutes to reach a ruling. I find the July will to be legally valid and properly executed. The January will is therefore revoked. Miss Clara Reynolds is appointed executor of the estate, effective immediately. Then she looked directly at Isabelle. In light of the testimony presented, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into possible elder abuse, fraud, and criminal negligence. Isabelle opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She had walked in draped in black like a queen at a funeral. She left under police escort, her eyes hollow, her performance over, and for the first time in weeks, I felt my father's presence again not as a memory, but as a force that had helped guide us to justice. The courtroom doors had closed, and with them, a long chapter of silence, manipulation, and grief. Isabelle's departure wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. The space she had occupied in my father's life, and mine, had been vacated. Now, it was time to rebuild not just walls and legacies, but identity. When I stepped back into the family home, it no longer felt like hers. The air had shifted. Cold marble floors echoed differently, as if waiting for footsteps that belonged again. I moved slowly through each room, peeling back layers of curated sterility. The angular sculptures and abstract canvases were replaced with pieces that held stories my mother's pressed flower art, my father's worn armchair, the soft rug I used to curl up on as a child with a book in hand. The warmth returned, not in color or furniture, but in memory, in the study, behind a cabinet Isabelle had kept locked for years. I found the quote my father had once framed: "The greatest inheritance a parent can leave their child is a few minutes of their time each day." I placed it back on his desk and stood there for a long time, just breathing. That was the seed for the Margaret Reynolds Fund. Using a portion of the estate, I created a foundation in my mother's name, one dedicated to children who had lost a parent to illness, and to expanding access to cardiac care in underserved communities. My parents' lives had been shaped by compassion. It was only right their legacy should be. 2. When Derek and Fiona reached out weeks later, I met them with the cautious distance reserved for former enemies who had glimpsed the truth. We would never be siblings in the traditional sense. Too much had been lost. But I saw the confusion in their eyes, the cracks in what they'd been raised to believe. I offered them educational trusts, with strict conditions designed not to reward, but to empower. Fiona entered therapy. Derek started community college. I didn't forgive all, but I let go of bitterness. They, too, had been shaped by a woman who knew how to manipulate from the inside out. We held a new memorial for my father at the Lakeside Sailing Club he had loved. The guest list was small: his closest friends, former colleagues, old neighbors. They shared stories over simple food, laughter echoing over the dock. There were no grand speeches, only honest remembrances. One of his oldest friends said, "Marcus never chased legacy. He lived by values. That's why he left one." I stood quietly by the water after they left, watching the ripples widen across the lake. No camera, no press, just wind and truth. That evening, back in the study, I ran my hand over the grain of the desk, the place where my father had written letters, read reports, and quietly planned to protect me from everything he couldn't say aloud. The blueprints for his company, his foundation, his hopes for me, they had all passed through this wood. He had believed in me before I believed in myself. I no longer needed anyone's permission to belong. Not in this house, not in this name, not in this story. My worth did not hang on inheritance or acknowledgement. It had always lived in the quiet decisions I made to keep going, to stay honest, to be whole. I wasn't rebuilding for revenge. I was rebuilding because the truth deserved a home, and I would protect it, fiercely. That night, as the last light dimmed through the windows, I closed the study door gently behind me. Not in finality, but in clarity, because true worth needs no recognition, and dignity cannot be taken, it can only be lived.